Welcome to The Bold Blueprint, a podcast for modern educators who dare to think differently. Here we explore the intersection of education and leadership, diving into bold strategies, innovative teaching, and the mindset shifts that drive real impact. Whether you're in the classroom, leading a team, or shaping the future of education, this is your space to learn, grow, and lead with confidence. Barbi, how you doing? Episode 3, here we go.
I'm doing good, thank you. It's kind of sunshine here and can't complain. My microphone's working, kind of, maybe. We'll see.
Episode 3, we now have a guest come into the Bold Blueprint. Barbi, do you want to do a bit of an intro?
Yes, and I get to say it like in an official space, it feels like. This is Dr. Poon Leung. I actually didn't ask how to pronounce your last name properly. But I've known Poon, I want to say since 2012, but I'm unsure when. And we met.
Correct.
Yeah,
Sounds correct.
outside this whole space of anything to do with work, but actually at Taekwondo. And then just from obviously knowing him since then and seeing everything that he's done since, I feel like I should read my notes on all this because you've done so much as well. I've always liked what he posts on LinkedIn and how he talks about what he does. And I'm like, I feel like our space can really learn from it. And what he does, I don't know what you call yourself, but I say you're a university lecturer and a data storing enthusiast with a PhD in mathematics, which sounds like it has nothing to do with education and care. But each time I saw Poon do a post or even talking to Poon, I felt like, wow, this is so relevant. Or you learn from it as you go. So I guess your reflections as you're teaching, even though it was higher ed and adults, I still saw so much in what we did, even with children or other people we work with. Especially around, I found Poon focused a lot on that belonging side, which we resonate with so much in early childhood education care and our schoolhouse care, and kind of peer connection, peer-to-peer and community within your cohorts. So those values I felt really aligned with ECE and USH, and I thought how you approach kind of a technical content with a human-centered, reflective way kind of disrupted the usual narrative and my own assumptions of what I thought a mathematics PhD. I still say we always called Poon professor, so I still say professor would be teaching and how it would be relevant. So that's why I wanted to get his knowledge out to other people, because I thought if I can learn from it, definitely I think it'd be beneficial to so many more. I've probably missed so many other great things Poon's also done along the way. The only thing I didn't confirm before we came on air, does your sister work in early childhood education?
So she used to be a high school teacher,
but
not anymore. She's changed into private industry.
Wow. Well, I reckon today's episode is all about belonging beyond the curriculum, and I can't wait to get into your brain and learn more. But I have to tell you a bit of a truth about me.
Go for it.
I had the worst mathematics high school teacher ever across the classroom, and I have to tell you that I reckon it gives me an adverse reaction when I have to think about maths. And I don't think it's about maths because they're numbers, they're written text, but actually I've got an emotional connection to maths because of my teacher. I don't know if you've ever heard of that before.
No, definitely. So I think in terms of the content in general, so it sounds like we're diving right in.
Sorry.
Part of like this whole like belonging and community is that it is a very emotional connection we have.
Yeah.
A very emotional reaction we have, even in something that we think, it's marketed as like pure logic, it's pure numbers, you just follow the rules. It's often about that emotional reaction we have, right, to this content, and that often shapes much more than the actual content. The emotional reaction shapes how willing we are to accept this new content, how willing we are to engage with it, to learn it. So for me, I was in the sort of opposite situation almost. So my parents came to Australia from Hong Kong when I was about 5 years old.
Wow.
Now, when I was in Hong Kong, we have a little bit of English in our curriculum, so I knew some basic words. But even from a confidence perspective, it's really sort of demanding, really, really stressful to be in this completely new country, speaking a completely different language, and having to sort of try and put a sentence together amongst and especially when I would have been about 5 years old. Right? That's its own its own set of stresses. But for me, my emotional connection with maths is it was sort of like a universal language, right? In
Fascinating.
in the sense that when I came over from Hong Kong, you know the sort of verbal language, English was completely new to me. Right? Even though I learned a few basic words when I was back in Hong Kong in school, in kindergarten, but when the teacher would write up a maths equation, I knew exactly what that was because I'd covered that in Hong Kong as well. So if the teacher wrote 3 plus 3, I just go, yeah, that's 6. What's your point?
Yeah.
Whereas the other kids would have to like get out their fingers and count. Okay, I've got 1, 2, 3, and I've got another 3, and I've
Yeah.
got to count. Okay, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? It just clicked with me. So for me, that was okay. That's something I understood. That's something I knew what to do in this sort of like completely different setting where okay, I don't understand what the other kids are saying. I don't understand what the teacher's saying. But when the teacher puts up 3 plus 3 on the chalkboard, I go, yep, that's 6. I know exactly what's going on. So that was my connection with maths.
And Barbie, what about yourself? What's your
With
connection?
math,
Yeah, it's a math. Yeah.
I'm dyslexic myself, but for some reason, math made more sense than words or spelling. I found I had no issues with it until I was smiling because I obviously did teaching and became a teacher, but I just stopped trying. I feel like at some point in school, stopped doing homework and everything. Maybe did a lot of wagging and missed units that I got so behind that I think when it came to year 11, 12, when I did, was that 2 unit math? I think they called the one up that I
Yep.
just had no idea what I was doing. So I did enough to get into it and then life didn't. But I liked it in a sense that it has an answer, whereas English, depending what you're doing, because often it's subjective, whereas maths
Yeah.
kind of like, well, you're right or you're wrong. English is like, it could be just who's reading it that likes it or agrees. There's so many other ways. Like, obviously, spelling's a different thing. And again, it depends where you're spelling from or what country and everything, because we all spell it differently. Whereas, like Poon said, that math side, I've never actually thought of it till you've just asked me, Jamie, what my thoughts on math were. I'm like, oh, yeah, it's just got an answer. I don't mind math.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Math, I think mathematics has a reaction. Like I think if most people you just ask a question like I just did to you, Barbie, people have a reaction to it. And I think there is either people I don't know if you agree, Poon, if people either love it or hate it or somewhere in between.
Yeah, I think for most people, maths is very polarizing. So
Yeah.
you do get the people that really, really love it, that tend to be a little bit more introverted. They don't really understand. Maybe they don't really
Oh,
understand
yeah.
other people, and they don't like that sort of, as Barbie was sort of suggesting, the open-ended nature of like English and some of the other subjects. Whereas like, there's really clear rules in maths. You have like the order of operations, BODMAS or PODMAS, whichever one you were taught. Like there's
Yeah.
a clear set of rules. You follow the rules, you get to the correct answer, and that can be reassuring for some people. Whereas other people
I
think,
don't,
oh, there's just so many rules there's so many rules to memorize, and they just get completely lost in it. Especially coming back to what you said earlier, Jamie, without being too judgmental. Like especially if say you have a teacher that is maybe not as prepared. Let's just say not as prepared as they ideally should be,
Yeah.
through not necessarily through any fault of their own. I want
Yeah.
to add, but if you have a teacher that's not maybe clicking with the way you learn, then that can be a big contributor to not enjoying maths.
I've got a question because I looked at your profile.
Yep.
So you're a university lecturer. You love using data to do storytelling.
Yep.
I believe that to be true. Um, And you've described yourself as someone who likes to bring humanity to data. What does that mean to you in practice?
Yeah, so I think it's a good analogy is what we've been talking about, like working with say like high school or primary students when they're first trying to pick up maths. Right? So the idea is to in data storytelling, it's yes, we live in our current world. There's all sorts of data out there, but how do we connect it to the human side? Because one phrase that sort of floats around is data driven decision making,
Mm.
right? Where we use data to guide our decision making process. We're not just going on gut feeling. We're saying, here's the evidence to back up my decision, right? But one challenge as in the data storytelling space, and a big sort of driver for why it exists is, as we've said, there are some people out there that just aren't as technical, which is fine, right? They've got other strengths in other areas. But if we're someone more technical, working with these less technical people, we need to be able to explain, hey, here's what's going on in the data. Here's why it matters to you. So we can do the more technical people, we can do the analysis and all the calculations in the background. But then when it comes to sort of crunch time and we have to say, here's why the data is important. Here's how it affects your decision, right? There is that gap there
Mm.
where you can't just say, well, here's a spreadsheet with all the data, or here's a graph that I made, you figure it out. It's, okay, how do we connect that together from the technical data side to, okay, here's what I actually want you to do. Here's the decision I want you to make. And so uh, starter storytelling is that sort of a really good way to plug that gap of saying, okay, so here's the data, but here's the story that it's trying to tell you. Here's why it's important to you. Here's why you need to make this decision. Here's what the data's saying that's relevant to you.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, over the years, because we're early childhood and outside school hours care sector is typically quite an emotional landscape. We're
Mm,
dealing with children's lives, families, communities, educators are employed by spaces, and having to go back to data driven decisions can sometimes give a bit of reassurance that
mm.
we can get some data. And I think I kind of resonate a little bit. Maybe I do have a love of maths without knowing.
I've
Yeah.
already converted one person.
I
Mm,
yeah, I wonder if it's a bit of our upbringing too, because when Poon was talking about it too, like I know you were talking about it could be more introverted or people, but it was all it's not relying on anyone else really in a sense. It's like it is the answer or it's not. Again, like it's there's more to it than just numbers. Yeah.
mm. And I guess in terms of the closed-ended answer, like, I very much used to believe that as well. I guess once you get a little bit further into math and start trying to connect it to like, real world sort of questions and things like that, right? It becomes open ended once again,
Yeah.
because let's say you've got an opinion poll where 63% of people support a particular idea, like support yes for something, and the remaining 37% say no. It's like, okay, so what do you do in that situation? So the numbers are 67 and the 33, whatever numbers I said just then, I seem to have forgotten. The numbers, even the numbers themselves, right before you get to what's the correct decision, those numbers themselves start becoming a bit subjective. Because what if you only if you ran a survey, you only surveyed a small part of the population that's not representative,
Mm.
right? So if you um, okay, and so there's these sort of subjective questions that start coming back into the sort of pun unintended equation, right? So these unintended, these problems that start coming back into the equation of, actually it's not really a closed-ended answer anymore. It's really, really open-ended,
Yeah.
and that for me is a big part of why I find this like data and data storytelling completely fascinating.
And
Wow.
then for me, for bringing this into this side, although I've never thought of the math side in that, what I was, as mentioned, I had thought of pulling in what we could learn from it, but I guess in a sense of what could education and care professionals learn from, I guess, a lecturer who values storytelling, community, and belonging. Because I'd also noticed who Poon interacts with is like, say, other professors in like leadership and all this. So I don't know whether some of the courses you do kind of go across this and we just don't even realize it, like on this outside. But especially in that, what we could learn. I always get nervous recording these, so excuse me if I just ramble on. Anyone stop me at any time, just for the genuine side. Jamie already knows. He's like, yep.
I honestly think that they're great questions that you're asking,
Mm.
Barbie, because these are the things that I think in the early childhood and outside school hours care setting, there is a lot of comparisons of what you're talking about, Paul. Could you maybe help the listeners kind of connect some of those dots for us?
Yeah, so stepping away from like the specific content, data storytelling for a moment, I think even though I mainly work with university students, whether they're undergraduate or like master's level students, I think there's still a lot of crossover. Not that I've worked in sort of the early childhood space, but so from a university perspective, look, what I would imagine are a lot of similarities. Say students that have just finished high school and they've just come into university. Right? That's a massive change.
Mm.
Right? There's a lot of it's a completely different system. There's a lot of, for better or for worse, there's a lot of unspoken rules that for example, let's say in high school, maybe during the HSC, there is a lot of sort of memorization, regurgitation in, say, like writing an essay, for example. I remember
Mhm.
when I was in high school, doing history. It's okay. Look, these are the five key points that they're going to be looking for. Everyone just needs to memorize an essay with these five key points, and you sort of change it slightly depending on the question. Whereas you get into university, it's much more open ended. Okay, so here's a situation. What would you do? And there might be still some key points that you need to memorize, but then it's okay. How would you apply those key points in this situation? Right? And it's not necessarily this closed ended or sort of regurgitated answer anymore. So it is a big change. A lot of students do find themselves in a completely sort of new setting. They do struggle navigating this new space, and even in the postgraduate space as well, working with master students. Quite often, it's I would say it can be even more extreme because we also have, like many universities, we have a lot of international students that are coming from a completely different country. They're working in a language that is not generally not their primary language. English is usually a secondary language for them. Again, like even if they've been to university in their home country, it's a completely different country, right? They come to Australia, very different set of rules. They don't know anyone. They don't have that sort of like family or network of friends that they can
Yeah.
rely on. It is a very sort of new space for them, and so
Do you
I
know?
think.
Do you know what's really interesting as you speak on this? And I'm bringing it back into our space. And
Mm,
in our space, we've got two frameworks that we work together on: the early years learning framework for the early years sector, and my time, our place, which is for the outside of school hours sector. But throughout that is this idea of having a sense of belonging. And I think, in episode one, I think myself and Barbie really spoke about our own personal history, about that identity and that sense of belonging.
mm.
And in episode two, we talked about if we were to take over the sector, what we would do. And there's actually a lot of common threads to what you're talking about, this idea of students feeling a sense of belonging, and you as a lecturer at university understanding that. Could you, for the listeners,
Yeah,
share what is it like in a university lecture hall? What would
yeah,
people experience, and how do you, as a lecturer, allow people to have a sense of belonging?
yeah. So in a lecture theatre, so you imagine like a very large movie theatre. So
Okay.
some of the largest theatres I've had to lecture in uh, could seat maybe like 500-ish students. So these are imagine like an IMAX movie theatre, right? So you're standing in front of, and a whole separate topic, which I won't go into today, is as the lecturer, managing just the nerves of standing in front of such a large room. But for the students, and reflecting a little bit on my time as a uni student as well, it is, despite there being more people in the class, it can feel more alienating, because it's like you're like, imagine you're in a movie theater, like, everyone else in the room, even though technically they're sort of quote unquote seeing the same movie as you've got no idea who they are. You can't really speak up and make friends, during the lecture. Your lecturer will tell you, hey, keep it down. Um, and so it really is like, you almost like you're there to see a movie by yourself. Now, if you're lucky, you came to the movie with a few friends, and like after the lecture, after the movie, you can have a chat about, hey, look, the lecturer said blah 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 blah. Oh, I didn't quite understand that. But it's just much harder to have that sort of, that sense of belonging, that sense of community when you're in a lecture theater. Um, and especially, again, like going back to the idea of, let's say you're talking about a student that's just come out of high school, where typically you're in small classes of around 30 students. You get much more sort of one-on-one time with your teacher. You've got sort of lunch and recess to play with your friends. You're more or less in the same small classes as your friends, so you see them on a daily basis. Whereas at university, the lecture might just be 2 hours every week. So you're physically in the same room for those that attend, mind you, for those that physically attend, you're in the same room as these people for 2 hours, and there's almost no, generally speaking, there's almost no opportunity to interact. So it is very alienating. It's very, very isolating relative to, say a typical high school experience. So I guess, look, my way, so being sort of aware of that, as much as possible, I try to make opportunities for students to interact. So, and there's a bunch of sort of, I'm sure there's a bunch of research behind this as well. I haven't personally checked, but also within the practice as well, there's the idea of, even though they're called lectures, it should not be a lecture. It should not be us standing there and talking for 2 hours, or whatever the case may be. Right. So there is the idea of, okay, so what can we have students actually do in the lectures, rather than just sitting there passively listening? Can we use that space as an opportunity for them to interact with each other? We've got all these people in the same room. Let's use that. So it's sort of transitions, if I use an analogy, transitions from being more of a movie where you're sitting there and just sort of almost passively watching, to almost like a live theater where you're part of the show almost.
Mm. That's what, like, say, sorry, I write a lot for anyone watching. I write a lot. If you see me doing this, something I've noticed when you've been talking, I've been writing down what you say, in a sense, or what I gather from it. But you've got a very good grasp and understanding of the variables. I wanted to use a math term. I don't know many of the variables of others, and not everything's just a given. Like, it's not an assumption they'll know straight away the language, like, because then I wrote down underneath, say, the language, or they may have no family around, or the social setting, it may be completely new to them. They may come from a small town with 100 people, and then suddenly they're in a lecture theatre with 500. So you, from the get-go, seem to have an understanding of those variables will be in play, whether it's because you've got that maths background. Because I know in our space, Jamie, this is what I want to see more of, that understanding of the variables. I know, you probably experienced it growing up too. I know for me, there's just this assumption, oh, you have a mum, oh, you have a dad, like, oh, you have somewhere to live, like, sorry, on that side. But if you go into everything you do and how you approach, whether it's in university teaching to adults, or for ourselves with the people we work with, because people make assumptions about the people they work with and their background, just getting rid of those assumptions, understanding there's so many variables, more than we can even think of, and then going ahead with your practice, I think it would change a lot of what you do. And I had put in a box here, awareness, like, and I put it in a box because what you sound like you do, you have that awareness when you go in, like I wrote down, it rings through everything you say, and especially about that transition around being I don't even know if I wrote this right. I wrote transition passive, and I'm like, hang on, those two don't go together. But in that sense, I know in education and care, I've got 2 kids, one in primary and one in early learning and one in out of school hours care. So it's like 3 different settings. I can tell a big difference between what educators prep the children for, but also what educators involve the children with can make a big difference instead of just being told, or even as a parent, this is what you're doing now because that's what we do. Bringing them into the conversation of, yeah, this is what we're learning about, but what can you also contribute as we learn along? Like it's I could be way off tangent. I have no idea but that's how it's coming across. Very much similar. And then just, that whole awareness. Again, it could be your own background. Like you said, when you came here at 5, you related to math, but then you would have probably been put into a classroom. I'm not sure how supportive a teacher or the school was at the time. Like if you were just expected to know and learn, even though you can't even understand, like you've probably got that awareness of what feels like just being put somewhere different. And then moving forward, that I think you still now, even from 5 to now, taking to what you do I was about to say as a teacher, but as a lecturer,
Yeah.
in practice.
Yeah, I mean, my personal background's part of it, but for me, what really sort of opened my mind up to these assumptions and these awarenesses is just throughout my time actually teaching at university. I wore a lot of different hats and just actually working with a lot of different students from different backgrounds and just having a chat with them. So many years back, one of the many hats I wore was I was a scribe for students with disabilities. And so what that meant was, let's say you have to do a test, right, an exam for a particular subject.
Yeah.
So normally, okay, I don't want to use the word normally, but let's say if you're sort of able-bodied person, you go into a big exam hall, you sit down at your desk with your student number, you open up the text booklet, do the test in 2 hours, hand the booklet in, right? That would be a very typical experience. But so some of the students I worked with that had disabilities, for example, they weren't able to physically write their own paper. So they'd have a printout of the questions, and we'd have a sort of whiteboard in the room. So it was me working one-on-one with these students. We'd have a whiteboard so I can just sort of map out their ideas, and then once they were happy with it, transcribe it onto the piece of paper. So just wearing a lot of different hats and just working with a lot of different students, I saw, oh, actually, not everyone has had my experience. Like I'm reasonably able-bodied. My experience of exams is I go into the exam hall and do the test paper. But just working with these students from different backgrounds, different different experiences, just said, oh, actually, it was really eye-opening for me. Oh, okay, so there's a lot of assumptions that I would make about my personal life that's, and before I worked with these students, I go, oh yeah, I'm quote unquote normal. Now I'm very, very abnormal in other ways, but in these sorts of experiences, right, I'm very normal. And yeah, just seeing that, oh, okay, it's these people have these students I'm working with have clearly a very, very different life experience to what I have. They're going to go through very different challenges to what I have. So for me, it's wearing sort of these different hats and working with like all these different students. That again really opened my sort of practice. Really made me question some of the things I took for granted, and said, "Oh, actually, other people haven't had my experiences. I'm not from a particular wealthy family by any stretch of the imagination, but at the same time, right, I have had a lot of privileges that maybe I've been taking for granted."
I think that's an interesting concept. So, as you're talking, it's so nice to have this
Mm,
discussion. You're using a lot of tools around adaptive leadership, and
mm,
I know Barbie and myself have spoken previously that in an early childhood and outside school hours setting, we usually have what is called a room leader that helps to oversee
mhm,
one age group of children in a classroom setting, and then people usually go through their journey of becoming maybe an assistant manager or center manager and then running the service as the nominated supervisor, coordinator, whatever you call that leadership role, and having adaptive leadership about understanding yourself and understanding how to kind of see what's in front of us so you can kind of adapt, using the word adaptive leadership, to where people are at, and there's not one size fits all approach. And I guess
Definitely.
hearing what you're talking about is that, yes, there's the output of doing an exam and going through that process from a university level, but how people get into the door to be able to complete that task is very personalized. And it's really heartwarming that you've used different methods to, I couldn't even imagine standing in front of 500 people and having this adaptive kind of style
Mm,
to allow people to have that experience. So good on you.
thank you.
Okay, so one of the things that I want to kind of pick your brain, and I'm going to be a little bit
Yep,
controversial right now.
go for it.
I believe that the early childhood setting and outside of school hours setting is education, and how that education looks is very different to the typical primary school state based learning and high school and university. And technology has gone leaps and bounds even in the last couple of years with ChatGPT, and being able to Google things now. And the
Yep.
old school way of learning is a teacher stands in front of student remembers the information, they then get tested if they remember the information, and they get a degree at the end, right? So I feel that early childhood and outside of school hours spaces are actually doing something that's a little bit different, which is around the 21st century skills, around collaboration, researching, being able to use mathematical concepts, but with others, that things that where robots and AI is far surpassing people's memory and context, that anyone now can learn by just getting the internet. The other day, I learned how to change a tire for the first time. I'm embarrassed by saying that, but I did. And I went on
No,
YouTube, and I didn't.
congratulations.
Thank you. And I didn't need to get a mechanic to help me where a couple of years ago I probably needed that. And I'm
Mm,
wondering to get your reaction, because it sounds like from a university space, and I know that you lecture at UNSW,
mm,
which does some really profound, state of the art, forward thinking, innovative
mm.
spaces. What is your concept around modern day teaching and maybe the way we've kind of always done it in Australia?
Yeah, that's very interesting, Jamie. Oh, Barbie,
Can
did
I,
you
as
go for
as
it?
former teacher, but as the mum of a kindy,
Yep.
I was going to say, when you were talking before, Jamie, they actually, I don't know if it was last year, they kind of transitioned back to the old style of learning.
Okay.
I was quickly trying to Google because I thought in my head it was rote learning,
Yep.
which is just repetition, but it's explicit. Is it called explicit teaching method? So it's very similar to it. But I have to admit, my thoughts of it and then seeing it in practice on my 5-year-old and
Yeah.
what she's learned already, but really eager and happy to learn, is
Yep.
incredible. So it is a lot of, I think there's still a lot more guided practice in it though. So this is me just quickly Googling it. It's like direct instruction and repeated practice, but also elements of guided practice feedback and checking for understanding along the way. Not sure if
Yeah.
that helps on that side of it, but yeah, seated in action, my
I,
love
I,
it.
I love that there's different perspectives, because there should be, and the
Yeah.
output is that we want people to be active, members of society that are learning in the best way possible, and not
Yeah.
being a kumbaya, let's just kind of make it up as we go. But
Yep.
Paul, I'd be curious to hear your perspective as a fellow educator and professor.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's a mix. So going back to what you were saying earlier, Jamie, about sort of there's some skills where you just sort of let's say rote learn it, you just repeat and memorize. I think there is a scope for that. I think there is a scope. There is some situations where that is appropriate. So just off the top of my head, for me growing up for me growing up in sort of kindergarten, sort of year one type of age, memorizing your times tables, right? Like you can't, my personal opinion, you can't get around that. You can't just say, well, just like type it into a calculator every single time.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, back then the argument was you're not going to have a calculator with you at all times, but we all have our phones.
Yeah.
We all have a phone, so that's no longer true. But I think there is, in some cases, still a value to having to memorize certain things, because even if, let's say, you have a calculator available on you, like just using the example of the times tables, like there's some basic things that you just really should memorize.
Yeah.
Some like basic like in this case, basic calculations. If you're a professional, there's particular maybe regulations or particular requirements that you need to memorize. So for example, in and I'm just sort of making this up. Please edit and clarify as appropriate. In an emergency situation, let's say you're working with a child or a student or whatever that's going into I don't know, some sort of shock or something. You don't have time to pull out your phone and go, okay, so what do I do if my student's lying on the ground and foaming at the mouth? Right? You don't have that time. So there is like some scope for memorizing. Okay, in this situation, like call an ambulance. Get like the other students clear. Give this person on the ground, give them space to breathe. Blah 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 blah.
No, I think you're right, and I think as you're talking, and the more I think about the question that I propose, I do see there being a bit of a mix, right? And as we're going through this podcast today, I actually probably use more mathematical concepts that I actually realize, which is around using data, around even thinking about problems and what potential problems that might be, and that then comes down to kind of then think of a whiteboard with a different kind of algorithms that is there, where I had such an adverse reaction to that without even realizing I was maybe doing it.
We assess risk all the time. So risk will be, I find, somewhat related, because it's trying to generate what outcomes and how many outcomes could come to a situation, and the probability of all these words I'm trying to use to sound mathematically smarter than I am all of the way. I don't know if it's working. No, but I'm finding more relates than I realize. But even or on both sides, like I know from seeing what Poon does and puts up how much different his lectures are. Like I think I popped in a screenshot. I don't even know if I can put it on here, but it was about, he had some feedback from, I don't even know what Slido is, but I'm guessing it's one of those feedback things. Am I allowed to read this out? It's anonymous.
Yeah, go for it. It's publicly available information.
Yeah, I stalked him on his LinkedIn for it. No, I saw it on there, and that's what made me be like, we need you on. Someone had popped in a comment of feedback from a lecturer, I'm assuming, that this class had helped me make my first friend in Sydney, and her company made me meet every deadline. Deliverable 1 happened before I met her, and I missed that one. After that, I didn't miss any SW, or deliverable
assessment. Yeah.
And then I know with Poon, what he put with his comment to go with that was he was resetting some of his polls, and polls I use in my teaching, and I stumbled on this old gem, a small reminder that apart from delivering content, my classroom is a place for human interaction and fostering a sense of community. You can see why I'm like, hey, I need you now on this.
That comes back to the 21st century skills that we were just talking about, right? That's amazing.
Sorry.
No. I guess my comment there also, like, I mean, so as I was saying, I think there is a scope for that memorization, but I would not call them 21st century skills in the sense that, like, these in an ideal world should have been around for a long time. So just using maths as an example, right? So one criticism of many from especially from like non-technical students is, let's say in high school maths, why am I learning trigonometry? Like, in what universe am I going to be using?
How is that student? Sorry.
No. That's fair enough. And I think depending on your teacher, and sometimes you get, if you're a high school maths teacher, you can get very easily caught off guard by something like that. It's, it's really hard to justify where this specific thing is going to be used. But in terms of taking a step back, the broader skill set, maths, unless you're working in a very, very technical field like astrophysics, engineering, so I could try and come up with examples where you would use trigonometry. Let's say you're building a bridge and you've got the suspension cable at a particular angle, then you need to be able to do those calculations. But taking a step back, um, it's about these sort of more hidden skills. In maths, it's very much approaching a problem from a logical perspective, being methodical about how you solve your problems. So let's say you're working with a student or a child that says, I'm hungry, and they're saying I'm hungry every day, right? So it's about taking that more logical approach. Okay, so what could be contributors to the students saying this? Maybe they're not getting enough food at home. Maybe they're just really hungry. Maybe they are getting food, but they don't enjoy the food that they're getting. Like, it could be all sorts of reasons. But actually just thinking through that process step by step and thinking, okay, so if this is the cause, then okay, what would be an appropriate solution? Okay, if this is the cause, what would be an appropriate solution? I've got 5 possible causes here. How do I, what's the next step for figuring out, maybe narrowing down some of those options? So it's about that methodical thinking. And I think with a lot of sort of education, there is, again, like this blend of both. So I need you to memorize it to sort of demonstrate you can show me the skill maybe, but at the same time there are these sort of hidden, sort of almost hidden in the background type of sort of skills that I want you to build, but in the longer term.
Wow. That's really, really fascinating. A lot of this that you're talking about today, I keep thinking the word courage.
Yep.
For yourself, what does courage look like to you in a classroom?
Yeah. Look, for me personally, courage, I haven't really thought about that one.
I did ask Poon on email, and you touched on it early. When I was like something
Yep.
about how he deals with the nerves on talking in front of like 500 people. Like, there's courage there for yourself, let alone for
definitely.
everyone else. And then I guess
Definitely.
it's how you
I mean,
adapt in those situations.
yeah. I mean, there was a quote that I used to like that I haven't really used in a long time.
Yeah.
What is it? Brave. What was it? Courage is acting in the face of fear. If you don't have fear, acting. Was it? And if you don't have
Can I
fear, that's
Google?
just called stupidity or something like that.
Oh, okay. So say it one more time.
So courage it's something like, and I'm getting it wrong, but it's
It's
something
okay.
like courage is acting despite your fears. It's not the absence of fear. Absence of fear is stupidity. Right? So
Huh.
if you're just not afraid at all, then you don't know what the risks are. You don't know what the downsides are. But
What a
courage is.
mathematical answer that you just gave is your inspirational quote.
I know I'm misquoting that because I
No,
haven't
but
used that one in a long
it's
time.
actually so true. Like,
Mm,
you're quite naive, and it's kind of having that false bravery, getting in
yeah.
front of people, not thinking about all the different possible scenarios, and that's fascinating. And going back to Anonymous on what Barbie just read out on the Slido
Mm,
moment, like, she was quite brave to go to university for her own reasons, but also how you
mm,
helped to support her by
yeah.
giving her a voice, and she found her first
Yeah.
friend. Like, that's
Yeah.
that's a lot of courage there.
Yeah. So I think, that definitely takes a lot of form. So from the lecturer perspective, as Barbie mentioned, for a lot of us as sort of lecturers or teachers, just being in front of that classroom, being in front of, however, whatever number of students you have in front of you, um, maybe it's a bit less direct, like making a particular decision, in my context of, okay, I'm going to assess in this particular way. I'm going to have to fail these particular students. Right? There's all sorts of risks behind that. Like, there's all sorts of, oh, what if I have these consequences? What if I have those consequences? What if it's not a popular decision I'm making? But I have to make it. Whereas from the student's perspective, uh, part of it could be, let's say, international students coming to a very different country, speaking a completely different language. That
Mm,
has its own, sort of set of courage,
mm,
sort of required to be able to do that. But even if you grew up here and you're just going to university, like that is, I'm not saying like everyone needs to go to university. That's the only way to succeed in life. But that is a very, for a lot of people, a very scary decision to make. you're going to a very different setting rather than, let's say in high school, you've got a relatively small class. You've got this um, really good support network of your other students, your teachers, stepping away from that and going into, let's say, a very big lecture hall where you don't know anyone. You can't rely on the lecturer in the sense that the lecturer now has to take care of, let's say, 500 students, 1,000 students. They don't have that time necessarily to work with you one-on-one to give you that individual support. Like, that is very scary as well.
I kind of find, and I wrote this down again, I write everything like one words in big boxes, but it's kind of like whether you're 3 or 23, learning requires safety around it. Like, even I know before we were talking about that belonging, but it's also safety. Like, I think you need to feel safe to feel like you belong. I wish I had someone like you when I was at uni. I already found it hard enough to go to uni. And when you're talking about that, whether you pass or fail someone, I remember there was one subject I failed twice. I'm pretty open that I have ADHD, and it was what they called back then special needs unit. And I kept failing on some ADHD paper we had to write, and I'm like, I didn't know I had ADHD then, but in hindsight. But I remember getting 49.5 and they still wouldn't pass me, and I'm like, come on, in context, and if you took in everything else that happens. But there was no attempt to get to know anyone in the class. It was just purely the data is like, that's your number, that's it. There was no relationship building. Like, it was such a different experience. Like, I can only imagine. And then that knock on just to your confidence, and I now know I have ADHD, but as someone with ADHD, you want to people please, but you're already so self-critical that just built up layers and layers on that didn't help at all in those kind of contexts. And I swear they knew in some sense, because I remember, again, how old I am, that my assignments were in paper, and they used to write on them with red pen, but there was a lot of red pen. And I remember for that one in particular on the ADHD topic, they wrote in bold at the top, you can't write, you need help.
Oh, wow.
But that was it. Like, and it came across like, well, duh, I know I can't, but like, and I'm more than happy for it. But it was like, there was then nothing to go with it. I also think the approach is pretty bad, but being young, just then you take it all personally. Like, where do you go for it? How do you do it? And it sounds like if I was in your class, it would be something that you would support people on, like, the kind of, again, back to the beginning when we said, like, understanding their own experiences and not assumptions into why that person, like, I missed so much high school because we already spoke about it, Jamie, in episode 1, because basically rarely went. There's so many factors. It's not because I was lazy and I didn't write it. I tried and I gave it a go, and then that was my best ability at the time, and there was no chat GPT at the time. But yeah, I really see that as safety, like, across the ages, so 3 or 23, and how we make, even whether they're a new educator as an adult, or even we have under 18s as well working as educators, to whether it's a new 3-year-old in your setting. It's like, how do you make them feel safe to make sure they feel like they belong, and not assuming anything about them in their context, their background and home life, and just so they can feel safe in that space with you there, in your environment, whether a lecture or a early learning or USH service.
It's really tricky, because I'm not defending the red marking and the red words on your paper. I disagree with that as well. But it's tricky because whilst we, at the same time, just as a bit of a counterpoint, at the same time, yes, while we want to be supportive, we want to have this idea of belonging, at the same time, and this is just a general comment, at the end of the day, you need to show me you can do this. If you can't do it, I do have to fail you, unfortunately. It's not, and just going back on something you said, Barbie, that idea that it is, and I went through a similar sort of thing, right? As a student, you do take it personally. You do take it as a comment on sort of you yourself being a failure, maybe. And so I think there is a scope for sort of more gently failing people. Because again, like, at the end of the day, it's, if you can't show me this skill, I can't pass you. I'm sorry, there's no two ways about it. But there is a space for, okay, let's be a bit gentler about how we fail people. right? So just as an analogy, like let's use getting your driver's license. Okay, like if I'm sitting next to you, I'm doing your driving test, and you run a red light. I have to say, I'm sorry, you ran the red light, like you did not stop. I have to fail you. You have not shown me you're a safe driver. Like, I'm not going to say, oh well, let's try again. Just make sure you stop. Okay, I'll pretend I didn't see that and give you a driver's license. What if you cause an accident in the future, right? Like there is this other side. So what I would say here is in terms of gently sort of failing someone, because part of it being a teacher and part of life is you do every now and then have to deliver bad news.
Yeah.
That's just life. But I think for me, it's being a bit clearer, but just explaining, hey, look, I'm going to have to fail you. So rip the band-aid off. My personal approach, sort of rip the band-aid off. Hey, I'm going to have to be blunt. I do have to fail you, but also explaining where possible with a bit more detail. Look, this is why I'm failing you.
Mm.
You have not shown me this skill, and just being clear in the communication that it's not a comment on them personally. Being clear that, look, I'm assessing you purely based on the work you've submitted. So this essay, so it could be as simple as in my setting, like let's say this essay has not met the requirements, as opposed to you have not met the requirements. Little language tweaks like that.
Yeah. I wrote down delivery of information.
Yeah.
It's like all in the delivery, because especially in the profession, like we're meant to critically reflect and constantly do improvements. And then I think, and which I love critical reflection. And it's just how people deliver that information for improvements, or even critical reflection to keep going. Because for me personally, I didn't care if I got more support back then, or just tips on what to do. Love it. I was about to say I love learning, but back then, and then it's just how we approach people on it. And I think also too, because there was no connection on that relationship.
Yeah.
So this person writing on it that had stood in front but hadn't really spoken to anyone, because that would be the tutor that wrote it. It was just like, oh, so same with children, and even as a parent in a setting. So if you have to deliver some information to a parent about a child, I used to hate doing this when I started out in the profession. I don't know why. I used to get so nervous letting hey, blah blah's done this to blah blah, and then just learning how to deliver that information better. Especially if it's 6 p.m., they've just rushed in from the train and you want to tell them something right as they're signing out. Like maybe that should be done in a different way. Maybe a quick phone call earlier if it's something they had to know before then, or just pending the being really, again, that no assumptions, or being mindful and adaptive on what the situation is. It sounds like everything is just adapting.
Yes.
Along.
And a lot of things around bravery and courage, and also that reciprocal relationship between student and teacher, like not just I don't know. That's a lot of things. I mean, Poon, I'm curious to you, if a listener only remembers one thing from this episode, what do you hope it is?
Yeah. So one, there's a book that was recommended to me, and I've got it open just so I reference it correctly. So there's a book called "You're Not Listening: What You're Missing and Why It Matters" by the author Kate Murphy. So in terms of like relationship building in education, in terms of shedding your assumptions, one big thing is active listening. And like for me, especially after I read this book, that really helped me sort of question my own assumptions, think about how to more actively listen without just slotting in my assumptions, filling in the gaps. If there's a gap, if there is a gap that I find myself, oh, I'm jumping to a conclusion here, making sure I ask a question. Hey, can you clarify what you mean by this? So that idea of listening, I think, is really, really important, whether or not you're an educator, but in terms of like just as a almost first step to building that relationship, just being willing to listen without an agenda. Just say, and I think one of the tricky parts is that with listening, one, it's a very much a learned skill. It's not something we're inherently born with. But also, I think within ourselves, one of the reasons it could be hard to actively listen to someone is we have this sense of, if I listen to you, I'm admitting that I'm wrong. Right? if I
Isn't that
open myself up,
fascinating? Yes.
you know. And it's something I personally struggled with as well. Like if I, for example, agree with a student, like if I agree with a student, or if I'm wrong about my, let's say I marked an assignment. If I'm wrong about it, that means I'm wrong. So it sort of reflects back on me as well. I used to take it very almost personally, if a student sort of questioned the mark I gave them, or whatever the case may be. But it's sort of, yeah, like maybe as I've matured a little bit more, it's about that listening. Okay, so why have you raised these concerns? So, as a quick example, a student might say, "I'm afraid I'll." After you ask a few questions, they're not questioning your mark directly, but they're afraid that they're going to fail the subject. And okay, so it's shedding the assumption. Okay, they're not criticizing me personally. They've just got this fear in them, and they don't want to fail. They don't want to have to repeat. Them, especially for international students. One thing I learned in my time was their student visas are very restrictive on like
Mhm.
how many courses they can fail, how many times they can repeat. So it's in that situation. It was the students were afraid about their own situation, and maybe it's like a younger version of me would take it personally. Oh, you're saying that I'm not good at my job. You're saying I made a mistake, where it's actually about them. And so just taking that time, just asking those extra questions.
I think a lot of what you're talking about is really resonating with myself. And it's
Mm.
interesting as we mature and we go through our life journey. In the early days, quite often someone would come to me and I'd start thinking of a response about why I was right.
Yeah,
And I think I could definitely definitely resonate with what you're saying.
yeah,
And I think over the years, what I've really learnt about, and what I talk to a lot of teams and a lot of, business owners, a lot of center managers, is what you're talking about, is really seek to understand, and also what you're talking about is look at data as well.
yeah.
Really understand what is it that they're truly trying to say. And I think I've got a story that's just came to mind, and it's such a silly example. And
I go for it.
gosh, it takes me back maybe 15 years ago, like less wrinklier than I am now. Um, and I was running an after school care program, and a parent decided to give a child a jumper that was quite a few $100s, and the child was going on an excursion to this really amazing art program. And it was everyone went on a bus, went to the excursion, and lo and behold, the jumper was lost. And the child went home, and the parent came in a full-on rage to me. Oh my gosh, where is that jumper? I can't believe that's gone. It cost a couple of $100. Immediately, I got defensive. I was like, well, a couple of things. Why are you dressing a child in that kind of clothing? Two, did you label your child's clothes? No. Okay. And then I immediately started putting blame on the parent. But actually, if I was to take it back a little bit
Mm,
further, I had to really understand why the parent responded in that way. Sure, she could have communicated to me in a different way, but I could have actually sought to understand. Very similar to the marking, right?
mm,
It's we didn't want the jumper to go missing, and I'm sure students don't want to not pass a grade, but it's really about
mm,
understanding and doing that active listening to really dissect that problem. And the future version of myself would be, okay, well, let's create a bit of a process and play so it's really clear about when children bring clothing items to the center.
mm,
Are they labeled? If they're going to take them off, where do they get put? Where do they get stored? Those kind of
yeah,
processes. And I mean, it's such a silly example, but it was quite a conflicting conversation that
mm.
a parent was literally screaming at me, and I wasn't understanding because I was like, "You're wrong, parent. You shouldn't have done that."
Yeah, I think it's also just on that as well, Jamie. On that, I think because maybe not to the extreme of the US, but we're a little bit litigious in Australia as well, and even I'm sure the parent wasn't actually going to sue the center over the jumper, but the idea of, well, I need to pin the blame on you before you pin the blame on me, rather than diffuse, like becomes that focus,
Yeah.
rather than, okay, let's just try to diffuse the situation, get rid of blame as the issue. get rid of blame as the issue here, and focus on, okay, so what next? And I try to do that with my students as well. So a little bit of a segue, although it's sort of related. One phrase I like to use with my students is, look, I'm going to give you coaching. I'm not going to give you therapy. And I don't mean like psychological therapy.
Yeah.
Like, I'm definitely not equipped to do that. But in terms of what I mean is, in terms of, let's say a student's got a bad mark, or whatever the situation, okay, I'm not going to spend time going through and sort of justifying the mark, but doing therapy of helping you understand and process why you got that bad mark. I'm going to give you coaching. Okay, here's what you need to do for your next assignment. Here's what you need to fix up. Right, the past is the past. That's done. Here's what the next assignment is, something you can still control. So what are we going to do there?
That sounds like mentorship right there, 101. At the end of every podcast, this has been such an interesting conversation. We've got a bit of a question for all of our guests that come on, Barbie.
Yeah.
I'd love to invite Barbie to ask you the question.
Gosh, am I going to ask it right? Is it about gigs? Yes.
Yes.
This is my short-term memory. No, I was just so listening to Poon and what he was talking about then. He did mention something before we recorded, and it was Poon's idea on the concept of like no sin in sincerity, and that's what I think he was just talking about just then. So I was just plugging that just there for it.
Yeah.
And I could see as you spoke about that, it's weird. I was about to say you lit up, because it was obviously not a negative, but dealing with, but how you deal with it. Love that side. Sorry. So the question was, we've been asking each other, because it's only been us so far, and this is only episode 3 of, what was your favorite?
What was your favorite or your first live performance you ever went to?
See, that one's a bit tricky. I'm not a big fan of live shows, so I don't go to many.
What was the first one that you remember?
Ooh.
And that's our assumption just there, Jamie.
It was. It was.
That was a bit of an assumption on your end. I'm really struggling to give an answer here, actually.
I had another question, if you don't mind me throwing it in, Jamie. We can always edit it out. But I was thinking the other day, because I wish I could talk to like 10-year-old me. Like, is there anything you would tell 10-year-old you now that you wish they knew? I didn't say that as well as it sounded in my head, but
yes, advice for 10-year-old me. I'll keep it G-rated.
Yes.
G-rated. For me, I think it's maybe not quite relevant to what we've been discussing today. That's okay. That's good. For me, it's don't be afraid to fail, because that's how you learn. So I think for me, especially in my sort of younger, less experienced years, there was always that sort of mathematical mind working against me. Oh, what if these 20 situations that could all go bad? What if one of those happened? Like, what if? And that is, for me at least, that was a big sort of barrier for me to sort of taking risks, trying new things. That being said, I can't complain. I'm reasonably happy with my life as it is right now. But I think like, just being more willing to accept failure and embrace it, and just see what I can learn from it.
And with 10-year-old, you'll be a doctor teaching at university.
There's definitely an Asian joke in there about excuse the pun, indoctrinated into being a doctor from a very young age. Probably not, to be honest. Like, like growing up, I definitely saw myself as this very sort of technical person. Like I would do a very like maths heavy type job, and there'd be very little interaction with other people. For me now, look, I still have a small sense of that. So I would say I'm a bit more introverted than extroverted. So, for example, after a big lecture, after interacting with a bunch of people, I do sort of need to recharge that sort of social battery but at the same time, I do enjoy the interaction while my battery still lasts.
I'm
So
exactly the same.
that's something, yeah, that's something that's not what I would have expected when I was younger.
Well, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for being our first guest on our podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I hope you got through this okay, and I hope we
Yeah.
interviewed you okay as well.
No, it's part of the learning process.
Yeah. No, thank you so much, Poon.
Entirely my pleasure.
Thanks for listening to The Bold Blueprint.
If you'd like to get in touch, you can reach out to us on
elm.net.au or
fireflyhr.com.au.
bye.
Bye.